My name is Steve Olsen. I'm an associate professor at D2 Management Engineering, and I will share this, the entertainment of this afternoon.
Beautiful, yeah.
So first, I have a checklist here that I have to go through because it's formal. So first of all, I'd like to welcome the assessment committee. It's Professor Tommy Dalgaard from University of Aarhus, Assistant Professor Joshua Mueller from University of Michigan, and Senior Researcher Per Sivers Nielsen from D2 Management Engineering. I'd also like to welcome, of course, Benjamin Goldstein, who is the Ph.D. student defending his thesis, and the supervisors, Morten Peter, main supervisor, and Michael Hauptschuld, and John Fernandez, who is somewhere in the sky.
He's in the ether.
In the ether. And of course, welcome to everybody here. Benjamin will present his thesis, assessing the edible sit in sleeping men.
Yeah.
And it's mostly about urban metabolism, you would say, right?
Yeah.
So we'll do a bit about that.
Don't worry, you'll find out.
He's been doing his study under the Ph.D. School of D2 Management Engineering. And I think that's about it. A little bit about what's going to happen. Benjamin has 45 minutes to present his dissertation, and after that we have a short break. Then the examination committee or assessment committee will have a discussion with Benjamin, and the whole thing is about to start at the latest 4 o'clock. And of course, everybody here is allowed to ask questions to Benjamin also. If you want to ask questions, you have to approach me in the break and tell me which question you're going to ask, so that I can see that there are time to do it before 4 o'clock. And I think that is about it.
Beautiful.
Who's done?
The floor is mine.
The floor is yours.
Beautiful. And the clock is rolling. So, very happy that you all can be here, either in person or on the internet, to see me present 3 years of work at the Technical University of Denmark under the supervision of Morten Brickville, Professor Michael Hauptschuld, and my external supervisor at MIT, Professor John Fernandez. And this project's called Assessing the Edible City, the Environmental Implications of Urban Agriculture in the Northeast United States. So, the challenge is that currently, as it stands, right now, with the population of the Earth, we're already seeing huge amounts of environmental impacts in feeding those people. That's in terms of climate change gases, land use and related biodiversity loss, water use, and of course, toxic emissions to land, air, and water. And this challenge is only going to become bigger in the coming decades because we're going to see more people on the planet, and also those people will probably be living in cities, most of them. And this is a challenge because the process of urbanization is interlinked with wealth creation. And so when people become wealthier, they tend to shift their diets to more environmentally intensive foods. So not only will we have more people, but we're going to end up with people that are going to have higher environmental footprints for their diets, or as I'd like to call it, the food print. So here I'm going to focus on the environmental footprint of cities, or the urban environmental footprint, which is the environmental impacts related to supplying the food to a population in a city over the course of a year. And just to jump right into it, in a review that we did last year, when we looked at the footprints of individual cities and mapped those versus their income, so you can see here, this is your footprint in terms of climate change, so greenhouse gas emissions, per person in each of these cities, which are the green dots, versus their income. You can see that there's a tendency for this footprint to increase. So not only, this supports the conjecture that I said at the start, which is not only that our people are going to be living in cities, but when they switch to these more environmentally intensive diets. And I'm not saying there's some mathematical law here. I'm just saying that there's this trend that you can see. And it's not only seen for climate change gases, but if you looked at the food print in terms of the amount of food consumed, it also tends to follow this trend. Or if you look at the amount of productive land area, it also follows this trend. And also what's important to see is that this green line, which is the average for my study, is well above the global average of the climate change food print. And so this might be an indicator of the scale of the food print that we might be moving towards as we head towards a more urban world. And also it should be noted that this food print is an important driver of total environmental impacts of a city. And this is when you compare it to mobility or building energy or construction or many of these other topics that get a lot of coverage on the urban sustainability agenda. Also troubling is the fact that if we plot this food print, now we're looking at the cities, the amount of food they waste within the city versus their income. You can also see a trend for people to not only import more food, as they, or not only to import and eat higher intensity diets, but they throw out more of their food when they switch to these diets. So that's a challenge not only because of the embodied environmental impacts, but also because when this food is thrown out, it tends to end up in the landfill or it tends to go out into the ambient environment. So it's not really being recycled back into the economy and being used in an efficient manner. So we have a food print that's growing, and we also have these impacts in terms of food just being wasted and thrown out to the ambient environment. And so some people have been trying to think about how we can deal with this. People that run cities, people that design cities, and people that also live in cities, probably most importantly, are trying to reimagine what an urban food system could look like. And so one of the key tenets of what they've been talking about in order to combat this food print and maybe to make use of this food waste is the localization of agriculture. Because they believe that this could lead towards an environmentally more sustainable food system. And right here you can see the signing session of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which is an agreement between over 100 different cities around the world, constituting more than 400 million residents in those cities. And it's an agreement to try and reduce their food print, not that they called it that, but the environmental impacts of their food system, and also to lead to more sustainable, or socially sustainable and economically sustainable food systems. And so this is only an example of many types of actions that are going on around the world, and by individual cities and also groups of cities coming together and saying we need to sort of tighten the belt on our environmental impacts related to our food. And so one of the things, when they talk about localization of the food system, one of the main things they look at is urban agriculture. And it's discussed sort of as a potential major technological change that you could make in the way you build your cities and run your cities that could reduce this environmental food print. And so to define urban agriculture, there's a lot of different definitions, but we'll just call it food production in and around cities using the pre-existing material and energy flows that already exist within those cities in order to grow food and hopefully reduce that food print. And of course they know that a single farm can't just feed a city. So there's a lot of talk, maybe not under the name the edible city, but about making urban foodscapes, you could call them, or as I called it, the edible city, which is now where you're scaling up urban agriculture so that it becomes an incredibly key aspect of the city in terms of the form and the function of the city. So trying to stick urban farming into all of the interstitial spaces within that city, all that extra little space, and trying to see if they can grow enough food to hopefully reduce that food print in some way. So then the question is, why do they think that this edible city and urban agriculture are going to be able to combat that food print? And we looked into this, my supervisors and I, in a review that we did, which also came out last year. And we looked at all of the evidence supporting urban agriculture as an environmentally sustainable food production method. And we found that when we looked at all of the evidence that are being made by academics and architects and urban planners and urban agriculture champions, that the benefits basically fell into 4 categories. Urban symbiosis, so this would be things like positive interactions between the farm and city by co-locating those 2 activities. So this would be like putting a farm on a roof and reducing the energy of the building that the farm is sitting on. Supply network efficiencies, this would be things like reducing the transport from farm to fork, and hopefully reducing the environmental impacts that way. In situ environmental gains, so this would be something like improving the soil in the city. And ex situ environmental gains, this would be something like allowing farmland outside of the city to return to its natural pristine state so that it could actually sequester carbon and increase biodiversity and things like that. And when we looked at all of these claims and compared them to the evidence in literature about what's actually happening, we found a pretty blurry picture. We found that some of these claims are very well supported. For instance, the building energy claim. This has been shown time and time again using green roofs. The supply network efficiency claim is sort of not so well thought out all the time. For instance, by reducing transport, okay, you reduce that aspect of the environmental impacts of a food system, but does that mean you've actually going to reduce all of the impacts of that food system over all of the different ways or other aspects of producing food? And then some of these claims are not really thought out at all. For instance, the idea of letting farmland go back to its pristine state is actually, I mean, that's not really supported at all in literature. So there's all these sort of this mixed message. And that made us once ask this question then, is localizing agriculture a good thing? And so that's sort of the main research topic here that I'm going to explore, which is the edible city and urban agriculture actually doing these things, or some of these things at least, that are claimed? Does it lead to more sustainable food outcomes from an environmental perspective? And lastly, hopefully by researching this, we'll be able to explore some of the ways that we make food prints and model the sustainability of urban systems. So there's sort of this practical aspect of trying to answer this policy question and also this theoretical development aspect. And so I focused on the Northeast United States for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, it's because it's got one of the largest food prints globally. Second, there are no real studies of urban agriculture and its environmental performance here. And it's got a lot of different types of urban agriculture with a very vibrant urban agricultural scene. And it's also not many people farming in the region. So it's a good example of where the logical end conclusion of the urbanization process is. So a lot of people living in cities, eating a lot of environmentally intensive foods, and not many of them farming. And I decided to focus on Boston because, not only because that's where my external stay was, but it's a city that's been very supportive of urban agriculture. This is a law here, or a document explaining a law to make land use laws easier for people to produce food in the city, and partially for the reason of environmental sustainability. And this is just where Boston sits within the Northeast region. So you can see. So then we have our problem. Is urban agriculture good or bad in this region? We don't know. And so now we need to figure out, first off, what types of urban agriculture there are. If we're going to test this technology, is it one technology or is it many? And when we looked at the evidence, it's actually a whole manifold set of technologies that exist. It's not just, there's not just one type of urban agriculture. And these different types could have very different environmental performance because of the different types of materials and energies that they need to use in producing food. So we decided to try and sort of bin the different types of urban agriculture into broad archetypes. And we did this using 2 different attributes. First was the siting of the farm. So is it on a building or is it located on the ground? Because this would have an impact on the capital. So the types of equipment you use. You can see there's very different types of equipment they're using. And also the ability for the farm to interact with the city is very different. Of course, if you're on a building, you can interact with that building's energy system. But if you're on the ground, you probably have a higher capacity to take in solid waste and to absorb rainwater because it's not limited by the structural capacity of the ground underneath it, while this farm is. So we have building integrated and ground-based farms. And then we combine that with conditioning, so the space conditioning of the growing area. So is that space just open to the ambient environment, like this farm here, or are you controlling for the temperature, humidity, lighting, carbon dioxide, things like that? because once again, you can see differences in the types of equipment they use, and also there's going to be differences in the supplies they need. This is going to need energy for heating and lighting, while this farm, it might not be so good actually in using the water and nutrients that you put down because it's open to the environment, so it can just sort of run off. So we have those, combining those attributes, you end up with these 4 archetypes. The ground-based non-conditioned, ground-based conditioned, building integrated non-conditioned, and building integrated conditioned. And we hypothesize that these 4 types would then have different material and energy regimes that would then thereby influence their environmental performance when they try to produce food. So then, how do we test these 4 types? And we relied on the life cycle assessment framework, which is essentially a way of looking at different stages of a product's life cycle. For instance, this is lettuce. And the discrete stages you would need to produce a product. So in lettuce, you need farming, processing of that lettuce. You need to retail it. It goes to preparation. And then it ends up in disposal eventually. And so what you do is you look at all of those different stages and make inventories of the resources that are going into those stages and the pollution that's coming out of those stages. And then you can aggregate over those different stages to develop resource or pollution footprints for this product. And so if you take a life cycle for one head of lettuce and compare it to a different production mechanism and compare that to the other life cycle, so you can then see, okay, which one is relatively more sustainable or has a lower environmental impact. And so there have been a bunch of researchers who have been very busy developing ways to use this method for different indicators. And here, I decided to use climate change, freshwater ecotoxicity, marine eutrophication, water resource depletion, land use, and non-renewable resource depletion. But I'm going to focus just on the climate change and land use for this presentation. So if you're interested, you're going to have to look at this publication to see the other results. And so what I did now that I have my framework, I went to the United States and I collected primary data for all of these different types of urban farms. I had 6 urban farms. 4 of them were in Boston. One of them, on the bottom right, was in New York City, and the one in the top left was actually a hypothetical rooftop greenhouse. And so I collected data on their resource use and also their pollution from the farms, and used this to build life cycle assessments of tomatoes and lettuce, and also 15 or a bunch of other different vegetables, but I'll focus on the tomatoes and lettuce here, which is also what this paper is on. And I compared these different farms using life cycle assessment between each other and also with conventional tomato and lettuce being shipped to my point of consumption, which is Boston in my case. So I'm comparing these farms with each other and also with conventional food supplies. So we'll jump right to the results here for climate change. On the left you have for the tomato, on the right you have for your lettuce, and the y-axis is actually the greenhouse gases emitted per kilogram of tomato or lettuce brought to the market. To the final consumer. And what you should take, and then these are your different scenarios, your different types of farms. And without focusing too much on the details, what you should take away here is that you have these elevated climate change impacts for conditioned farms when you're growing in Boston. So these really tall impacts are really elevated above your conventional tomato. So even though when you bring farming into the city and you avoid sort of this transport impacts, this is the amount of transport impacts for your conventional tomato. Even when you avoid those can be more than overwhelmed by the impacts needed for the supplies to grow in the city. So this is something that's really important for people that tend to focus on this food miles argument. Just because it's local doesn't necessarily make it sustainable. And this is something that is really hasn't been explored too much in the urban agriculture literature, or at least by people that champion urban farming as a sustainable food supply. But at the same time, you can see that some of these farms do actually perform better in terms of their climate change impacts. Right here, these 2 ground-based, non-conditioned farms. So these are the 2 farms that are just on the ground, operating open to the air, with very little inputs coming in. And then the last thing I would take away is that these interactions between farm and city are actually pretty minimal. They didn't really have a huge impact on improving the environmental performance of the farms in the for those farms that I looked at. I would say the only exception is this farm right here, which is a farm sitting on top of a building. And because it was on that building, it was able to avoid electricity for that building that needed to heat that building. And so you end up avoiding this amount of climate change because you can you subtract those greenhouse gases that you would have used otherwise. And so you actually end up, if you subtract this black part from the part above the horizontal line, you end up also with a climate change footprint that's better than conventional agriculture. However, this is only one indicator, and when you look at more indicators, you see a more nuanced impact profile. For instance, when you look at land use, now those two farms that were performing better for climate change, those two ground-based non-conditioned farms, are actually, they're performing about equal to conventional agriculture here, but they're actually much worse when you're growing lettuce. And so it's just, once again, to highlight the complexity of the situation, which is that, you know, just because you're looking at one indicator doesn't mean that's the whole story. And there's these different trade-offs between different types of urban farming. And I would also highlight that the embodied environmental impacts, so the land use impacts needed to heat this greenhouse here are also pretty large, just because you need to have land outside of the city to support the infrastructure to get the natural gas to heat that greenhouse. So with that in mind, I would think, okay, is urban agriculture the best way, putting on my policymaker hat now, if I'm a mayor or somebody in the city and I'm trying to push for a more, at least climate-friendly city, is urban agriculture necessarily the best way to use the amount of space I have in my city? Because that's the most scarce resource you have. And this is a nice illustration, I guess, of comparing different urban agricultural technologies against each other, as well as those technologies versus solar power. So what this is basically per meter squared of area in a city that you apply your technology on, it says how much do you change the climate change impacts of that city. So if you're actually above zero, that means by, for instance, building a rooftop greenhouse and running it on the current grid that you have in the Northeast US, you're actually increasing the greenhouse gases of your city. However, if you move to the right, you can see that for some technologies, like these ground-based non-conditioned farms, you actually have marginal savings per meter squared of farm put in. And if you actually had renewable energy sources heating your greenhouse, you could have significant reductions in your impacts. You could have about 22 kilograms of CO2 reductions per meter squared of urban farm put in place, because you're substituting conventional tomatoes with a leaner environmental tomato. But then if you put in solar power, you actually end up reducing your climate change impacts by about 70 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So I think this is an important takeaway here, is that first off, policymakers should be suspect or circumspect about the technologies they use, and also maybe they should think of alternative technologies outside of urban agriculture. So this was at the single farm scale, which is nice, but like I said, that can't feed an entire city. And the goal of this project was also to look at this edible city and scale it up. And like I said, my case city was Boston, and I had three distinct goals in assessing, I guess we'll call it the edible Boston. First is to develop a baseline food print. So the food print I was talking about at the beginning, I wanted to develop a food print for the city of Boston because it didn't exist, no one had done that study, and I wanted to do it in a way that was unique and at least try to explore different methods. Because normally what people do when they do this food print is they look at the national average food print and find a way to scale to your city or something like that using the incomes or some other proxy. So I wanted to do a way that was demographically sensitive. I wanted to look at the people that actually lived in Boston, what they ate, and try to make a more sensitive food print to that. And I also wanted to map that food print and see if there were any sort of interesting findings that came out when we did that. I also need to calculate the growing area, and that's both on the ground and on the roof. And then I need to compare the baseline in the edible city. And once again, I wanted to do this in a way that was a little more richer than what we've seen in the past, where typically people use conventional agriculture minus the transport as a proxy for urban agriculture, which is sort of not a fair way to compare the technologies and where the edible city could get you. So to start, I dug into the ExioBase, which is a very nice database that gives you basically the environmental impact per unit of final economic demand. So for instance, if I buy €1 worth of beef in the US at the US market, it'll tell me what the environmental impacts are related to climate change, land use, and other indicators. And it's nice because it not only includes the direct impacts from that industry you're purchasing from, but it also includes the impacts from the industries that are undergirding your final industry that you're purchasing from. So beef uses, of course, fertilizers and other things. So it includes those impacts. And then also it accounts for recursive flows. And that's just a fancy way of saying that when, for instance, when you produce steel in a factory, you need steel in that factory to produce the steel you're making in that factory. And then you need steel to produce the steel that you needed to produce the steel. And it's an infinite loop that keeps going. And Exio-base and this method that they use is nice because it includes those impacts. So it should be a more complete footprint, an environmental footprint compared to the life cycle assessment method I was showing you earlier. However, so in a perfect world, I would take my consumer expenditures for different demographics of food and multiply it by these factors, the environmental factors for the foods you're eating taken from this database. But unfortunately, it's not a perfect world. Particularly, the challenge here is that food impacts they don't increase linearly. Just because I buy twice as much food in dollars doesn't mean I purchase twice as much food and that I have twice as much environmental impacts. You can see this when you look at dietary surveys and consumer expenditure surveys of the US. People that actually purchase a lot less in terms of dollars for their food, the amount of food they consume is actually pretty much very similar in a lot of ways for the main drivers of food prints in the US diet. And you can also see this as, from anecdotally, when you look at the lifestyle-related diseases in the US, people with obesity and diabetes tend to be actually have lower income and spending less on their food, but they might actually be purchasing some of the more environmentally intensive foods. So to circumnavigate this, I had to find a way to find a different currency that people are using. Instead of dollars, I relied on calories. And so I said, if I know all the greenhouse gases due to, for instance, grain consumption in the US economy, and I know how much grain is being produced to supply the US economy, then I can make an equivalency between them. And then I can find, okay, if I know how much grain is consumed by different demographics, I can then develop the food print for grain for that demographic. And fortunately, all this data is available in different databases. Unfortunately, also, there are challenges with this method. For instance, the poultry sector in Exio-base actually includes egg production and chicken production. So that means I have to split up those environmental impacts for poultry between different products. And when you do this, you end up mixing things up, and it can get a little confusing and a little bit arbitrary how you split these. So that's also a challenge. Nonetheless, moving forward, I was still able to develop these food prints as a start. And so here you can see on the left, your climate change food print, the average climate change food print in Boston. In the middle, you see the average land use food print in Boston. And all these different colors are different categories of food. So the dark green relates to land use food print for meat, and so on. And then you can see these food prints, the climate change food prints represented cartographically for different neighborhoods in Boston. And I think there's a few things to take away from here. First is that the spread, so the standard deviation around that mean food print, is actually very small. So I probably could have used the average food print for Boston and got a similar result. I could have just used a national average or something like that. But I think when you look at it cartographically, you can see some surprises emerge. For instance, some of these areas with higher food prints, so the darker red, are actually some of the lower income neighborhoods. And you never would have captured that if you'd taken an average food print or if you'd used the traditional Exio-based methodology. The same was also found for the land food print. And so I think there is something to this method that can be explored further, but it's definitely a work in progress. Let's put it that way. So in terms of the food print and what we learned when we sort of dig into it, first off is that meat and dairy are two of the important drivers of the food print, and this is, of course, something that has been backed up time and time again in other studies. What I would say is that the proportion of the total food print is lower than what you would find in other studies, and this is probably because of the way I was splitting up that Exio-based database again. So there are challenges there that need to be explored, but nonetheless, it pointed in the right direction. Another thing that I would point out is that the scale of the climate change food print is actually much lower than you would expect for a a country as wealthy as the US. And this could be because the XIO-based database doesn't include land use change currently. Future iterations should. But you would expect this to be at least 2,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per year per person, as opposed to 1,200. So this is a question for the practitioners and the developers of XIO-base to maybe think about, does this completeness argument that they make normally, that it should actually display more environmental impacts, does the method always give you those outputs? So we have our baseline footprint now. The next step then is to figure out the land in Boston for urban agriculture. And so I did this using two methods. First, I used an additive method. This is where I took the area of Boston and then added on those types of land that could be used for urban agriculture. And so, for instance, adding vacant residential lots. And when I did all of this for the different land types, you end up with 2,000 acres of potential urban agricultural space. And I also did a subtractive method. So now I look at the entire area of Boston and assume that it can be used for urban agriculture, and I subtract land uses that can't be used for urban agriculture. So for instance, building area. Keep in mind I'm looking at ground space. I'll get to the building space later. Building area and roads. And so you end up with actually 8,800 acres of land. So you can look at these as the lower and upper limits for urban agricultural space in Boston. And so when you see the results, you'll see a plus and a minus. And just remember counterintuitively that the scenarios where I'm using minus are actually where you have more space to grow. So building space was also a challenge because of data limitations. Ideally, I would have the structural capacity of every building in Boston so I could see whether it could actually hold urban agriculture. You don't have that data. No one has that data. So what I did was used the year of construction as a cutoff to see, to sort of limit buildings older than that cutoff from being able to host urban agriculture, because there are links between the year of construction and the introduction of building codes and evolution of building codes, which do relate to the structural capacity of buildings. So I looked at buildings and I said, if they have a flat roof, if they are under a certain height, and if they're not historically designated, then we'll assume they can be used for urban agriculture. So at most, we had about 420 acres of urban agricultural space on buildings. And at least for when we had a construction year of 2000, so only buildings after 2000, you had 26 acres. And that's how it's distributed throughout the city. Last thing then is to optimize the edible city. We don't just want to grow urban agriculture. We actually want to try and, if we're heading towards environmental goals of reducing the footprint, then let's try and grow it in the best way possible. And I did it to optimize two different aspects of the footprint, the climate change and the land use footprint. And so what I did was basically took the non-conditioned farms, so farms on the ground, open to the ground, and farms on the roof, open to the ambient environment, and grew 15 types of vegetables on those types of farms. I chose those farms because they're the only ones that I had data for more than tomatoes and lettuce, so I'm not just trying to feed Boston with lettuce and tomato. And also because they actually performed slightly better than conventional agriculture, which is nice. So I'm not just comparing worse technologies against the conventional footprint. And then lastly, while I was optimizing for all of these, while I was optimizing for these two aspects of the footprint, and keep in mind separately, I'm doing different optimization runs. I'm keeping track of building energy savings, how much solid waste they simulated, and the rainwater capture they had as well. And also, I should have mentioned back here that because I didn't have all the data for the buildings, sometimes I had to stochastically assign whether it had a flat roof or not. And so that means I did Monte Carlo scenarios. And so you're going to see error bars around my solution. And that's because I did this. So moving forward then to the results. Where does the edible city get us? Drum roll. And here are the climate change and land use impacts in terms of where does it change us from the footprint. So my left axis for either of these is the gross change in footprint. So for instance, shift from the baseline climate footprint in terms of tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And then your right axis is the percentage change from your footprint. And then these are your different scenarios. So this is when, for instance, CC plus is when you're optimizing to reduce the climate change footprint using the amount of farm space that we estimated using that additive method. So I think the takeaway, without going into the details too much, is that even when using all the land in Boston to grow food that minimizes the climate change or the land use footprint, while the climate change footprint, you actually only end up reducing that baseline footprint by about 3.5%. So it really should make somebody who's pushing these types of policies wonder if this is the best way, once again, to reduce that footprint. And then even perversely, strangely, when you look at land use, so now it's the same. These are your change from baseline in terms of gross footprint and percentage. This is in acres per year for the entire city. You actually end up increasing your land use footprint. That's because even though some of these farms have a lower land use than conventional agriculture, some of the fruits and vegetables they grow don't. So you end up having these trade-offs. Even though you're reducing your footprint in terms of climate change by a couple %, you're actually increasing your land use for the city and how much land it needs to grow food and ultimately support all of its functions. Of course, it's marginal. I should also add that in. It's like 0.4%. So, I mean, it's not an egregious policy decision to sort of do it, but nonetheless, it sort of should make people wonder if that's the best way to use your land. And then solid waste assimilation. So this is one of those urban symbiosis interactions. How much does it help us there? And when you look at the best scenario, so this is the year 2000 when I'm running that building year cutoff. This is when you have not as much building space, so you're using more ground space and you have more capacity to absorb waste. When you can actually absorb about 8% of the city's baseline organic solid waste, which is not insignificant, but not necessarily either as big of an impact as some of the urban agriculture champions have made it sound like the edible city could do. Then looking at runoff attenuation, so rainwater capture. This is, once again, sort of understated. You don't really get a huge saving. At the best scenario, you end up reducing the amount of rain water that your storm sewer system has to capture by 1.7%, which is not, once again, a drastic change to the city's annual stormwater reduction or stormwater intake. But it should keep in mind that potentially this could capture rainwater during very high rain events, during heavy downpours. And so because of that, you might be able to avoid actually overflows in the sewers and then raw sewage runoff into your local waterways. So this is something my model can't capture, but might be a potential benefit of urban agriculture. So having looked at those indicators of performance of the edible city, it's worth wondering, okay, maybe environmentally it doesn't seem to be a silver bullet as a technology in terms of reducing the footprint, but maybe there's some other stuff here that it can actually contribute to. And so I actually explored some alternative motives of what you could do or why you might want to grow urban agriculture. And these are things like social motives to bring a neighborhood together, nutritional aspects to give people healthy food to eat, economic aspects, maybe giving them jobs, or just because, frankly, people like farming and greenery around them and might just make a city more aesthetically pleasing and better to live in and improve their quality of life in that way. And so I explored a couple of these, but I'll just focus on the nutritional intake, actually. And here I'm looking at how much urban agriculture in these different scenarios, again, when I grow food in the city, in the edible city, how much it contributes to the recommended intake by the United States Department of Agriculture of dark green vegetables, other vegetables, and red and orange vegetables. And these aren't categories I made up. These are actually the way that they sort of recommend you should eat food. And it turns out that Boston, as it stands, has a deficiency in their intake of these vegetables. And so maybe by supplying nutrition to the city, you can actually avoid some of the lifestyle-related diseases I was talking about before, or combat them in some way. So when we look at my scenarios that I was running before, for instance, these additive scenarios, the land, optimizing for land or climate change, when you don't have as much space, you still supply a significant amount of the recommended vegetable intake, actually. I don't know, about 30% of your other, 30 to 40% of the other, and about 50% of your red and orange. And then actually, if you have this subtractive scenario, where you actually have more space to grow, you can supply significant amounts of the other vegetable category and red and orange category. So this is the total percentage of the city's recommended intake for those vegetables. So, I mean, that's a positive story. And if we actually optimize and change my optimization scenario to actually try and produce as much of that nutritional recommendations as possible, without favoring any one of those types of vegetables, you can actually grow 100% of Boston's nutritional needs for dark green, other and red and orange vegetables using the land within the city, and actually also have land left over to grow other stuff if you want to. So this is a positive takeaway, and maybe something that could influence policymakers in that direction. Now, if the edible city is not necessarily the way to reduce the food print to a level that maybe we need to get it at to have a sustainable urban future, perhaps it can be complemented by other things. And here are a few books that have basically tried to articulate the idea that what we choose to eat might be more important than the way it's produced in terms of environmental impacts. And so I explored this because, like I said before, the diet tends to be meat and dairy tend to be the largest drivers of the food print, both for land, both for water, also for, land and climate change, but also for water and many other indicators. And so maybe by trying to combat these directly, we could reduce the food print better than with the edible city. And some urban policymakers have actually been pushing for this. For instance, the mayor of Turin was asking the city to become a vegan city in order to reduce the environmental impacts of their diet. So I looked into this. This is results from an upcoming article, and this is a similar article that was published last year in a Danish context. But this is basically comparing shifting from the mean diet of the mean Bostonian diet towards either a vegetarian diet where you don't eat meat or a vegan diet where you don't eat meat or dairy. You can actually see that by switching to these diets, you can reduce your impacts, your food print of Boston by much greater amounts than if you were to actually optimize the city here, comparing to the optimized edible city. So it actually is a much greater, probably, policy mechanism to try and get some people to try and switch their diets and reduce this meat and dairy intake. But of course, changing model parameters is a lot easier than changing behavior. I mean, even knowing what I know about food sustainability, I look at that and I still want to eat it for some reason, because it's like it's just in my nature. It's learned behavior, and it's also evolutionary behavior. And so I was lucky enough to team up with Impossible Foods out of San Francisco, who have been making this meatless burger, and look at maybe what the introduction of that single burger, that single product, substituting for ground beef in the average American diet, what that would look like. And even just by substituting 25% of the average American's ground beef intake for this product could net you much larger reductions in your food print than if you were to use the edible city and optimize it using those technologies that I'm looking at right now, of course. And of course, if you were to get them to eat 50% of this, you get even larger benefits. So maybe this is something that policymakers should be leaning towards, is maybe not urban agriculture as a technology to change food prints directly, but indirectly maybe helping people feel more in touch with the food system and changing their behavior and maybe switching towards things like this because they realize the amount of work and environmental impacts that go into making food. So with that said, I think I've sort of covered the territory of what I was hoping to look at. And so probably nice to wrap up with some closing thoughts. First off, revisiting the food print. It's an important driver of urban environmental impacts, and it should continue to see attention in the urban sustainability agenda. Before 2010, it was basically off the radar. And since then, there's been a lot of actually recognition by urban policymakers, designers, and citizens that we need to start looking at this, which is nice, and this work should continue. Urban agriculture. The main takeaway message is that food miles, this idea of localizing food, is not always the best way to achieve your goals. Sometimes you can get environmentally leaner production pathways, and other times it's not. And context matters. Cities should pick and choose their technologies carefully if they're going to try and promote this, if they have the power to, of course. And then other land uses in cities, such as putting down solar panels and substituting for the baseline electrical grid, might actually be better in the Northeast US. The edible city, it has meager environmental benefits, but potentially meaningful social benefits. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. It's just probably not right now in the technologies that are proliferating on the Northeast US. It's not worth doing for environmental reasons currently, but we'll see how that changes with technology. And maybe you want to promote it, like I said, to try and couple people's awareness of the food they eat and the environmental impacts embodied within that. And then complementing the edible city. Like I said, making people more aware and hopefully changing their behavior might be more of a way towards a sustainable urban future. And then future work. I think I'm in a position to at least say some things about where we could go with this. Primary data. I think the way I did the food print, maybe using that Xio base and splitting it up has some challenges to it, but the idea of trying to make contextual food prints within cities and mapping those has some merit, because you've seen actually that when you map nutritional outcomes for residents and compare it to the restaurants and supermarkets nearby, you can actually see that this does have an influence. There's a link between built form, morphology, and their nutritional outcomes. So maybe there's something similar with food prints, which would be cool to look at. And if we could get primary data to do that, all the better. Urban agriculture. I would also say that we want to look at peri-urban agriculture. I only looked at within the city, but expanding outside is of course important, and looking at those technologies. An increased number of sites. I only had a limited number of cases to work with, and so if we could have more types of, more farms and more data, we could at least sort of zero in on the actual average performance of a typical farm instead of just having one case to work with. And of course also keep covering those types of urban farms that are becoming more and more prevalent, such as these indoor farms that are really high tech, and maybe they'll develop into more sustainable farms in the future. But right now, the ones that we looked at tended to not perform so well. The edible city, and I put in brackets region, because we want to look at more than just the city. We want to expand outside of that and look at, the city region and how that food system interacts and the exchanges between city and its hinterlands. Including other parameters and how we're estimating farming space, of course, pollution and shading. So you should remember that those impacts, or the land area, was actually a really optimistic assessment of how much you could grow in a city. So even though my edible city didn't change the food print much in this scenario, it would probably actually change it less, because you probably have less land to use. Improved modeling of urban symbiosis, including industrial symbiosis, so placing farms beside factories to use the extra heat from factories might be able to offset some of those impacts we saw before. And of course, socioeconomic benefits. And then lastly, complementing the edible city. Like I said, changing model parameters is pretty easy, but actually changing behavior is difficult. So working with behavioral economists, psychologists, and people that know how to use econometric models might be able to add a richer discussion to that. So I think I'll say thank you to all the lovely people at QSA, even though there's a lot of new faces, but still. These are a lot of the people that were there through this entire journey, and thanks for the support. Of course, also thanks to John Fernandez and all the people at the MIT International Design Center for supporting this work, bringing me over to Boston, and giving me a place to work from, and adopting me for a little bit of time, I guess you could say. And I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to the people that took all the nice photos I was using. So with that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben.
You're welcome.
Very nice presentation, and 45 minutes. That's good. Yeah. We will have a small break and meet here again at 2 o'clock Thursday, when the examiners will have a discussion with Ben.
Great.
So, see you there.